Hello everyone, and welcome to a short presentation on the corporate open source strategy. My name is Dirk Riele. I'm your speaker today. I've worked in industry for a long time for SAP in the Silicon Valley, for a Swiss bank, in research and development. I also started a couple of software startups, software vendors. So in this talk, I will look at corporate open source strategy. I will focus on open source that is competitively not differentiating, so saves you cost. That is two of the main reasons why people engage with open source, how to save costs. People typically will also add, well, you also get shared innovation and standardization. But if it's competitively not differentiating, it's in the open, then I subsume it here under save costs. So after a short introduction to open source, I will focus on saving costs through open source. Also quite important, but only shortly touched upon in this talk, is how to create revenues through open source based products, and I will shortly touch on the relevant business models. I will then put all of this together under the umbrella of the corporate open source strategy. So just as a quick reminder, open source software is just software, but given to you under an open source license, where the open source license grants you certain rights. That's its definition. It grants you the right to use the software free of charge, to modify the software so you have to get it in source code form, and to distribute the software to third parties, modified or not. That has been formally defined by the open source initiative, and that is the gold standard of what makes open source software. Well, open source software didn't come about because of closed source software and vendor lock-in, but open source software is a fabulous tool to combat vendor lock-in. Vendor lock-in means if you are using a software vendor's closed source software and you're locked in because the switching costs to alternative software, not necessarily open source software, is high. So high that you don't do it, then you're locked in. And that, of course, allows a vendor to continuously increase fees, making life hard for the user or customer of that closed source software. But it's really not just continuous fee increases by your for-profit vendors. It's also the innovation blockage that comes from being locked into closed source software, because there is that market window of opportunity for your own business, and you can't take advantage of it because you can't modify your software to work with that window of opportunity because you are using closed source software. Would be different with open source software where you have the source code and can modify it. Also, closed source software comes with the operational risk that the vendor goes bankrupt, the software lands in escrow, and you can't get updates, fix bugs, etc. Not so with open source. That operational risk is quite prevalent in situations where the industries have much more long-lived products like planes, automobiles, etc. than the typical life of a software vendor supplying software for it. This and many other reasons make open source software an attractive alternative to closed source software. When you look at open source software, you really need to make a distinction, though, between community open source software, which has an open governance process, and what I call here vendor-owned open source software or single vendor software, which does not have an open governance process. It has a closed governance process. In both cases, it's open source software by license, but only community open source software lets you participate. If you try to make a contribution, you have a chance of getting your contribution in. If you want to have a say, you will, if you do it properly, be listened to and can have influence. With vendor-owned open source software, which is being developed for commercial purposes, you will not get that say because the software, even though it's made available under an open source license, has a closed governance process, not an open governance process, and thereby goes the way the vendor wants it, typically for profit purpose. This really is inherent in the open source definition, focusing on the artifact, the software only, and not on the governance process. So you can make a distinction: software, open source software. By license, there's open source software. But if the governance is closed, then it's vendor-owned open source. If it's open governance, then it's community open source. So, saving costs through open source. Saving costs is an important part of your profit equation. Now, when you look at your software, maybe you're using software in a product or just in an in-house application. But when you're looking at your software, and when you're using open source software or any third-party software, you need to understand the dependency graph. The code you write depends on libraries you include. Easily 80%, 90, 95% of your code is open source code by being dependent on it. And so this is an illustration only. You can see how your code references open source libraries, which pull in further libraries, and so forth. You get tiers of suppliers, where an open source project is counted as a third-party supplier here, much like a closed source third-party supplier. And what's an illustration here in practice can get complicated quickly, multiple tiers, multiple levels, and quickly you don't quite know what you're pulling in. In practice, easily thousands of components, of which you mostly only understand, or your architects and developers are mostly just conscious about the first tier, the first level of dependencies, the libraries they specify they want to use, but those pull in further, and so forth. That is the code in your product or application. Now, how that code makes it into your product, and I find this important to differentiate, is the software supply chain. The dependency graph is just the logical architecture, the code architecture of your product, but how you get to those components that you put into your product as binaries, that is the software supply chain. So you have this dependency graph, and you might have it build it all in-house, or you might pull it in from third-party suppliers as well. And that can be a lengthy and complicated supply chain. So there's an open source programmer who puts code into an open source code repository like GitHub, which gets compiled and put into a binary code registry, ends up in a product, which is a third-party library, which is distributed by someone, and then ends up on your promise. So every single step along this supply chain, potentially other people outside your company have a handle on what is being passed on, supplied to the next chain link in the supply chain, which creates a major security risk, and this has been the topic of much debate lately on how to secure the software supply chain. So much so that the US, kind of leading in the space, or the US government agency leading here, require now what is called the software bill of materials, an inventory of all the software components that, say, a purchaser of some software must receive together with the actual binary code of some application they are buying or paying for. That software bill of materials is just a data structure, but it is something that needs to be created for any software. And even though here now it has become a formal requirement of purchasing by government agencies, everyone needs to have that. You want to understand, even if you're building in-house software, the complete inventory, the materials of your own application. If you don't know what's in your code base, then you have a potential security problem. So first of all, you need to understand the dependency graph. meaning all the components. And then you need to understand your supply chain, ensuring that none of the components that are not under your control have been tampered with. So this is both a very traditional license compliance problem if you are shipping products, but primarily here, and by focus of the US government agencies, it is a security problem. You don't want to be at the receiving end of a tampered with software component, open source or not, and hence you need to get a clear handle on understanding what's in your software and ensuring that it has been built right without tampering. So with that, open source is a dependency. You create a dependency on an open source component by choosing to use it. There are good reasons. You're saving a lot of cost if it's quality software and you're using it in your products. But again, it's a dependency. It's also an investment, but first of all, it's a dependency, and hence you need to understand what that means for your business. So if all you do is use the open source software to save costs, that's great. Then you need to understand, as just explained, what's in your software. That's the so-called software composition, and you may have to run a software composition analysis process for that. Also, as just explained, you need to secure your supply chain. You need to make sure that your suppliers are proper and that nobody tampers with it. There are various approaches to that, from having obviously contracts with your suppliers all the way to independently verifying that build software binaries conform to the original source. However, as your open dependencies on open source software becomes more and more important, you may choose to contribute to open source software projects, and you may even want to lead open source software projects. I'll explain all of that in a second. The typical first step to start contributing to open source projects is that the software you are using has bugs and you had to fix those bugs. You don't want to keep those bugs in-house, you just want to contribute them back to the open source project so that with the next iteration, the next release of the open source software project, your own bug fixes come back to you, rather than that you have to apply them and reapply them and reapply them, etc. So you're really just reducing costs again by contributing competitively, not differentiating bug fixes back to the open source software. However, if your software, if the open source software is quite important to your in-house applications, or even what you bring to your own clients, well, then you want to be competent on those open source projects. So you contribute to build competence. And also you contribute to ensure influence by being recognized as a player. If you are visible in an open source project and you make contributions, then effectively by contributing, you are buying some influence. You're being taken serious as opposed to more serious, as opposed to just being a user who's lurking and is quiet. Beyond contributing, you may actually choose to lead open source project. This has the benefits that you are leading the standardization on open source projects, which may be de facto standards. You may be leading in shared innovation, so you're the first to know about it because you're leading it, and you can align your roadmaps, product roadmaps, application roadmaps with that standardization and shared innovation. Effectively, if you're leading open source projects, and it's important open source projects, you're creating industry platforms that you're building on and that others will then be using and building on and following your lead. Now, these three escalating levels of maturity, if you will, of engaging with open source, using, contributing, and leading open source, apply to your dependency graph in different ways. Using open source software happens across all tiers. contributing to open source projects only makes sense to the upper tiers that have an immediate impact on your business, where you are using them in your applications, they are visible in your applications, not just buried deep down. And leading open source projects mostly makes sense for the first tier, which are really specific to your domain, be it financial services or automotive, and that's where you focus on leading open source components and platforms. As you decide that you need to go beyond just using the software, but you want to contribute back or may even want to be leading open source projects, you should view that dependency that dependency that you're creating really is an investment. You should view it like that. And it needs safeguarding. That dependency should not go sideways. You don't want it. Safeguarding means contributing or even leading the open source projects, but how do you do that? How do you maintain that investment, that the way you influence it is predictable and doesn't go sideways, turns left or right without you knowing or expecting it? Well, industry has found a way of doing that, and it's called the Open Source Foundation. So far I talked about community open source software, which is open source software, maybe developed on GitHub or somewhere, which maybe you can contribute or even play a leadership role. But if it's just random software, then there is no structured governance. That is different with an open source foundation. And as open source projects became economically important, companies realized they really want to have a clean, fair and equal playing field. And that's what an open source foundation gives you. An open source foundation is a non-profit organization with the mission of managing, sponsoring, developing open source software that is competitively not differentiating. So here is the key. It is a non-profit. It makes the software available that's being developed under its guidance as open source software. And it really only works well if that software, what goes into the open source software, is competitively not differentiating. Meaning nobody puts features into the software that make a difference for them in the marketplace. Because you can't. As soon as it's open source software, others can benefit as much as you can. So a basic idea of how to get to that is to use the Kano, the original Kano model for bucketing features. You do not want to develop delighting features or performance features usually as part of an open source foundation. You want to focus on basic needs in the open source projects, which are under the guidance and governance of an open source foundation. So anything that's a basic need is great for collaborative open source software development. So again, the benefits of having an open source foundation is that it, if it's done right, provides a fair and equal playing field for its members, meaning clear governance rules, clear intellectual property rules, so that no single party or group of parties can hijack the open source projects, leaving you empty-handed. There are any number of examples where actually that has been attempted by way of confusing or not so confusing, just skewed bylaws with companies getting more than one vote, etc. So avoid those and look for clean, simple governance rules, that fair and equal playing field that makes sure your investment into the open source software is safe. I want to dig in a bit more here, knowing that the audience of this talk are usually not software vendors, but users of software, financial institutions, maybe automotive companies. So when you look at software, you can distinguish between components for use in products. So that's vendors who share in the development of components that are competitively non-differentiating, as open source components. So the automotive or web UI components, etc., that's just components in products. And a typical license for these products, for these components, would be permissive license, because vendors want permissively licensed open source code, so it doesn't affect the proprietary license they put on the final product, of which the open source component is a part of. Now, separate from components and products, you might also be using or developing applications for use in your internal business operations. So it's not a product you're selling, you're just using the software. And the IT industry started that. So for example, Git as a version control system is a tool used internally by companies, and it's not a product for most companies. Office software, same thing. Interestingly, now we have open source software, though, that is a business application in any domain. So for example, GNU Health gives you, as a software project under the Free Software Foundation guidance, GNU, for operating hospitals. It's software, open source software for operating hospitals. It's not a software product, it is enabling the provision of the actual product, healthcare or operating hospital services. And so open source software is not just focusing on the technical domain as an application, but on any business domain. And it's being developed by users in that domain. So when I talked about open source consortia, I know we can see the emergence of two types of consortia, open source foundations. I use that synonymously. Vendor-led and open source-led consortia, because they're vendor-led open source projects for components and products, and user-led open source projects for applications and business operations. So the latter, because they are from outside the IT industry, often create their own consortium, their own equal and fair playing field, catering to the specifics of their business domain. Not one size fits all. Hence, there are specialized consortia, foundations for user-led open source project, which I call user-led open source consortia. So these are open source foundations led by the users of the software who manage the development of the software they need to run their businesses. It's not in their products, it's in their business operations. Again, the software must be open source and it's competitively not differentiating. The development may be sponsored or also developed by the companies, the user companies. So here are three examples. About 15 years ago, I helped set up Open Consequence in Germany, a non-profit. Well, it took a while until it became a non-profit, but for managing and sponsoring the development of open source software for the smart grid energy revolution. So these are the small local energy providers quite unhappy with the closed source software being provided to them for operating the management of the energy distribution, and they joined forces across Germany to develop the software they need to run this business as open source software. They're pooling the money and they are sponsoring the development of the open source software they need. Another example is the OpenMDM project. This is not a separate foundation, it's a working group at the Eclipse Foundation, which is just another way of getting your own governance for managing and sponsoring the development of software on test data in automotive production line and in car production. So again, this is software to operate, part of operating a business. It's car manufacturing. It's not the car itself. That would be the product. It's the car production. And hence there are different users, OEMs, who sponsor the development of the software. Even though the OEMs have strong capabilities of developing software, they reserve that for their products. So the car infotainment stack or cloud software for the cars. but not in this case for business operations. And finally, a fun example out of left field, the Hollywood movie studios decided to join forces, and they're also collaborating and developing open source software for movie production. So we have 3 examples of users of software who sponsor or outright develop themselves the software they need to operate their businesses. And they decided to do so using the open source foundation model to get a fair and equal playing field, to get everyone on board, ensuring that the investment, that is the dependency on this open source for the users, is safeguarded by way of proper governance. And that really is an important trend. And since again I'm talking not to the IT industry here, I believe, but to other industries, even though you may be heavily relying on IT or on software, it really is a trend that goes broadly across many different industries now. I have a new favorite example in Germany, which is the Open Logistics Foundation. That's the German logistics companies who joined forces to develop the software they need to operate their businesses. They finally, by way of open source, managed to standardize the manifest, the cargo manifest, which was hard before that. And many others, originally in education, in automotive, and in financial industries, and so forth. So this was how software user companies join forces to build applications for in-house use for the business operations, not for the products. If you build software, if you want to use open source as a business strategy to create revenues, you are a vendor selling a product, and from that you are, generating revenues. And open source may be helpful here. The 3 classic business models that we know of as kind of patterns of business models are the traditional service and support firms. They are the original firms like Cygwin, for example, where you simply support community open source software. Your customers are companies who use the open source software, just want to feel good about it, and hence they set up a service contract with you in case something's wrong, bugs need to be fixed, etc. This is not a VC-funded model because it relies on community open source. The barriers to entry are the skills and capabilities of your people, which is a little bit of a barrier, but not a big one. And it also does not command high margins, usually. More interesting is the business model of the open source distributor, where you have a company like SUSE or Red Hat as a Linux distributor, which take out the complexity of putting together 10,000 components into a well-working product. It still relies on open source, community open source mostly, but the intellectual property that remains proprietary is how these components fit together. The compatibility matrices, the configuration data, the regression test suites, all of that. That makes it a sustainable business model and also a VC-funded one. But the third business model is blowing everyone out of the water, because that is the novel, the new, if you ask me, startup model, Silicon Valley startup model receiving VC funding, which is vendor-owned open source. So a vendor develops software, makes it available as open source software, but keeps a tight lid on it. It's an open source license, so the artifact, as explained in the beginning of this talk, is open source, but not the governance process. The governance process is closed. Any contributions will require copyright transfer to the vendor and so forth. I'd call it the new proprietary open source, because there's a proprietor, the vendor, who commercializes it. So putting all of this together means that you need to understand how to make decisions and who makes these decisions. A company that engages with open source sooner or later sets up an open source program office. The very first step is not to do anything at all and then to give it to a lawyer. I very much hope that whoever is listening, that you don't delegate open source to your lawyers, but rather have at least a person part-time, over time usually a staff function or an open source program office, which is a central function across the company that manages the engagement with open source. They usually have an approval role because separate from the open source program office, you have a line of business which wants to use open source in an application or in a product. And so there's an interplay of the line of business wanting to use some open source software and the open source program office having the capability of saying, we can support that, we can approve it based on our guidelines that this is an appropriate license and it will be managed securely. And the open source program office, again, as a central function, will provide various services. But it's the line of business which should be selecting and observing the dependency on an open source component. They also choose to contribute, and they might choose to lead in the line of business, with the open source program office supporting them with it. It's critical to understand that a good corporate strategy on what open source company should you use. Do you manage your dependency by contributing? Should you start leading open source projects and the development of a platform? And these are line of business decisions, and the open source program office can support you every step along the way. But it's a support role because they are not the line of business. They don't know about the specific business purpose of an open source engagement. But they might operate for you the tools that ensure it's secure components you're using, safe and secure components you're using. And as you're leading open source components by participating, for example, in Open Source Foundation, an open source program office may also be consulting or facilitating or maintaining an overview of how different lines of business engage with the Linux Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation and so forth. So there's an interplay. Business decisions about saving costs and creating revenues with the line of business, and the OSPO, the Open Source Program Office, supporting the lines of business in doing so. Now with that, I touched on the software supply chain, meaning saving costs and the economics behind that, mostly by way of user-led open source projects and foundations in this talk. If you are seriously thinking, well, you probably have been, about a more complex corporate open source strategy, you will have to look at other aspects too. On the basic level, not just securing your supply chain, but license compliance and the details of security with that, making choices about foundations and consortia which to engage with requires deep thought. Of course, you may want to consider different commercial business models in case you want to buttress your products, or you are an IT vendor, then it might be your primary go-to-market strategy. And then how to put it all together as a corporate open source strategy under the guidance or in the interplay between a line of business and an open source program office. I offer this as a full-day seminar, customizable to my customers' needs. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And even though I could only touch on selected issues on this broad topic, I'll be happy to talk about various aspects I may have skipped, so feel free to be in touch. Thanks again, and hope to see you around.